The word Islam means submission, submission to God. And Muslims believe that all that they do in this life is to be in submission to God, and the Arabic for God is Allah. So the word they use for God is Allah. And Muslims believe that Christians, Jews, and Muslims all serve the same God, that it is the same God, just looking at that God from different perspectives. For example, the Rumi, who is a Sufi poet that we'll look at later in this slideshow, said that the lamps are different, but the light is the same. Muslims believe that the final revelation of God, the same God who gave the revelation to the Jews in the Old Testament, to the Christians in the New Testament, gave a final revelation to Muhammad, and that is what the Quran is. So Muhammad, as you see on this slide, is the founder of Islam. He was born in 570 AD or CE in Mecca, and he considered himself the most blessed of men. Because he was an orphan, he was raised in a poor home by his grandfather and his uncle. Both of his parents had died. But as he grew up, he married a rich widow. And he was very much in love with her. And they had a daughter named Fatima. And Fatima married the first Imam of the Muslims. The Imam, I-M-A-M, is like the pastor, the priest. He is the leader of the congregation of Muslims. And so Muhammad's daughter Fatima married the first Imam, and so he considered himself the most blessed of men. As Muhammad was going out to meditate on his blessings, he was in some caves outside of Mecca in 610 AD, and Allah, or Allah, pronounced both ways, revealed to Muhammad through the angel Gabriel, revealed what became the Quran. So the angel Gabriel came to Muhammad in the caves and ordered him to recite. Now this is part of the supernatural belief that all religions share, that because Muhammad was illiterate, he could not read or write. So the angel Gabriel ordered him to recite what would later be the sayings of the Quran. They were written down later, but Muhammad remembered them and told the people when he came out from the cave. So when he came out and told people about his revelation, which the big thing was that there is one God and only one God. You have to remember that he was living in a polytheistic society where the religions there had many different gods. So when he said there was one God, there was a lot of upheaval. People were not happy with him. They basically ran him out of town, and he went to Medina and stayed there about 20 years and established a community of Muslims in Medina before he was able to come back to Mecca. The Quran is considered God's final revelation to man. As stated earlier, Muhammad received these revelations in the cave from the angel Gabriel, and then he recited them. He told them to people as he went about preaching and teaching. But the revelations were not written down until after his death. The word Quran means recitation. And so that makes sense with what I've just told you about reciting them. Muslims believe that the original Quran is written in gold and is in heaven. That if one is to study the Quran, he really needs to learn the Arabic language first, because the only true version is in Arabic. Everything else is a paraphrase. And though, of course, the Quran has been translated into many different languages, all the languages of the world, true Muslims will learn Arabic so they can read it in the original language. And that is why we hear the Quran recited only in Arabic when you hear it in Muslim countries and if you go to a mosque. The Quran is organized into surahs, which are chapters, and there are 113 chapters plus one. So please write in your notes there are actually 114, because it's 113 plus one, which equals the introduction. So we'll look at the introduction later, but that equals 114. There are two other holy books of Islam. One is the Hadith, and the Hadith is where we have commentators on the Quran and the traditions about Muhammad, how he acted, what he did, what he said that are not in the Quran are covered in the Hadith, so that if there is ever any question on a subject matter from the Quran, one can go to the Hadith to find the answer. And then the Sharia, which means law. And the Sharia is a complex legal code that is based on both the Quran and the Hadith, and it is used in Muslim countries worldwide today. First of all, I want to tell you that there are two different types of Muslims. There are the Sunnah Muslims, S-U-N-N-A, and they follow the Prophet. The Prophet is Muhammad. They follow the Prophet's tradition, what he did, what he said, and they look to Muhammad as an example. And the Shia, S-H-I-A Muslims, are the ones who thought that after Muhammad's death, his cousin Ali should succeed him, and so that all rulers would be ancestors of Ali. And the Sunnah are a little stricter in the way that they look at the government of the Muslims. The Sunnis believe that the best man is the Caliph or the ruler of the Muslims, and the Shia believe that it needs to be a descendant of Muhammad, and then of course of Ali, who was a descendant of Muhammad. So the 5 pillars of Islam. Shahada, the profession of faith. And the profession of faith says, there is no other God but Allah, and Muhammad is his messenger. And that is said 5 times a day in the ritual prayer. The Salat is the ritual prayer. It is said 5 times a day facing Mecca, said before the sun rises, at noon, at mid-afternoon, after the sun sets, and at twilight. And so you recite certain verses from the Quran and also do certain movements that range between standing, kneeling, and sitting down on the floor. And also you must wash yourself, clean yourself 5 times daily, every time before you pray. The zakat, or the alms tax, is an assistance that you give to the poor in society. It is at least 2.5% of a person's annual savings. Now, this is on top of what you give weekly to the mosque. To my knowledge, there's not anything in the Quran that says that you give a certain percentage to the mosque, but it does have to be supported. The mosque is where the Muslims meet for worship, and their weekly gathering is Friday at noon. The room has no chairs in it because everyone is equal. The altar faces Mecca, and Muslim artists use geometric designs and writing in decorating the mosque, but more on that later. The Psalm, or fasting, is another pillar of Islam. And fasting, you may have heard, you may have known people who fast during the month of Ramadan. And the month of Ramadan changes. It's a different month every year because you fast from sunup to sundown. You know, and think how difficult it would be to fast from sunup to sundown the month of July in the South. So it is based on the lunar calendar, and it changes when that month is. But there are no food and no water, no drinks during the entire day until after the sun goes down for an entire month. And then Hajj, which is the pilgrimage, and this takes place at one point during a person's life. If you are financially and physically able, at some point during your life, a good Muslim will go to Mecca on pilgrimage. And this is a visit to the Kaaba, which is the first house of God on earth, which is now in Saudi Arabia. And about 2 million Muslims gather there to confirm their faith and to remember and act out the story of the prophet Abraham when he left his son Ishmael and his wife Hagar. And so you remember in the Old Testament we talked about Abraham and Isaac and Sarah. In the Quran, it's the same Abraham, but the emphasis is on Hagar and on Ishmael. And so Muslims will do these 5 pillars throughout their entire life. These are the main tenets, the basics of the Islamic faith. As I mentioned earlier, the mosques are decorated with geometric designs, and they are also decorated with sayings, with writings from the Quran. And these writings are done in a beautiful script in calligraphy, and the word means beautiful writing, and I'm sure you're familiar with this because we have this word today, but it came to us from the Arabic world. And the most characteristic form of calligraphy is Kufic, and the next slide will show us that. But throughout the mosque, you will see these verses from the Quran. You will see geometric designs. You will see designs of waterfalls and of beautiful green trees and shrubbery. What you will not see is a picture of God or of Muhammad. Muslims believe that you cannot show God, that he cannot be seen. And so there are no pictures depicting him or Muhammad anywhere in a mosque because you cannot depict divinity. One of the most characteristic forms of Arabic calligraphy is Kufic. The word Kufic comes from Kufa, which is a city in Iraq, where Arabic script was refined during the 7th and 8th centuries. There are many variations of even the Kufic script. As your book tells you, there's the early Kufic, Eastern Kufic, foliate Kufic, knotted Kufic, and square Kufic, all which have great designs and are very beautiful to look at because remember they were used to decorate the mosque. And this particular Kufic script is from a previous edition of the textbook, and it is the testimony of faith. There is no other God but Allah, and Muhammad is his messenger. Keep in mind that Arabic, like Hebrew, is written from the right to the left. Islam has a 1,500-year history, and its communities are found in every part of the world. In that long history, it has always had a building that was used for prayer and for worship, and that building is the mosque. And so Islamic architecture pretty much always involves the mosque in some form. The mosque itself is simple. It's just to meet the basic needs for prayer. And so it's just a covered building, which came to be covered with a dome. So the dome was considered particularly associated with the mosque. And then inside there, it's nothing because you get on the ground to pray. You're on your knees in submission to God. You know, just like Muslims will take the prayer mat with them when they pray in the mosque, it is prayer mats are there or it's carpeted so that they can get on their knees and worship Allah. So there's no furniture of any kind. We do have the minbar and the mihrab. Now the minbar is the pulpit where the imam will stand to speak to the people, and the mihrab is the niche in the wall that points towards the east, that points towards Mecca, so that they always pray towards Mecca. One word I don't have on here that you need to remember is minaret, M-I-N-A-R-E-T. A minaret is a tall spire that is used in Islamic countries to call people to prayer. So those very tall, thin spires that you see a lot of times with mosque and other places are used to call people to prayer. Many of the mosques will have a fountain as well because heaven for the Muslims as described in the Quran is a place of flowing water. You know, think about it. With a religion that was started in the desert, it makes sense that water would be part of heaven. So we have fountains that represent that, but also fountains that are used to cleanse oneself. Because remember, you have to wash yourselves every time before you pray, so 5 times a day. And so fountains are used for that purpose as well. The Dome of the Rock, which is a spectacular example of Islamic architecture, was built on the Temple Mount in Jerusalem about the end of the 7th century. But a little bit about the Temple Mount. The Temple Mount is the place where many Christians, Jews, and Muslims believe that Adam was buried. It is Adam, the first man, Adam and Eve. They also believe that it is the place where Abraham was ready to sacrifice his son Isaac, if you're a Jew or Christian, and Ishmael, if you are a Muslim. And the 9th century story also says it is the place from which the Prophet Muhammad traveled to heaven during his night journey. And also, it is the building of the second temple of the Jews when the Jewish temple was built in like 70 AD. So this is a very disputed piece of land. Back and forth, all three religions claim it. All three religions would like to have a structure of some sort for their particular religion, and it did go back and forth for a while, but the Dome of the Rock was established there at the end of the 7th century and is there today. Some believe that it may have been built as a counterpoint to the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, which is right across the street there, and the Church of the Holy Sepulchre is believed to be the place where Jesus was buried. And of course, this is important to Christians. And it's just, as you'll see in the next couple of slides, it is just a magnificent structure, one that was changed a little bit in the 1300s when it was originally decorated with mosaics, but in the 1300s that was changed to geometric tile. It is topped by a gold dome, very important and iconic structure for all of Islam. So here is the Dome of the Rock. You see the golden dome on top. You see the geometric design that is used all on the outside. You see the columns, they look to be more Corinthian columns. Of course, there was influence from the Greeks and the Romans. They influenced everything that was built, but it is truly an Islamic structure. The inside is decorated with verses from the Quran, and it was built by a caliph is a head of the Islamic Church. It was built by Caliph Abdul Malik in the 7th century. And as I mentioned earlier, during the Middle Ages is when those mosaics were replaced by tiles. The Mosque of Damascus, often called the Umayyad Mosque or the Great Mosque of Damascus, is in Syria and was built by the son of the builder of the Dome on the Rock. It was completed in about 715 AD and it was built on the site of a Roman temple. It is decorated with a mosaic that depicts heaven because, of course, there are no human figures allowed because you cannot depict divinity. But the mosque is known for the beautiful depiction in its mosaic, which depicts heaven. And you can see a picture of that in your textbook on page 250. You see the beautiful trees there, and you see houses. But of course, there is an absence of any human figure. While the picture you have in your textbook on page 250 is a mosaic from the interior of the Mosque of Damascus, I have chosen here to show you a picture of the outside of the mosque. So you can see, first of all, you can see the dome. You can see the minaret in the background, which is where the muezzin called the faithful to prayer. And then note that what's in your foreground there, that is actually a fountain. If you look closely, you can see a human figure at the bottom. So that tells you how large it is. That gives you the scale of the mosque. And remember that a fountain would have been there because the people were to wash themselves before they went in to the mosque to pray. Islam spread quickly. Just 10 years after the Prophet Muhammad's death, it spread through all parts of Arabia, Egypt, Syria, Iraq, and parts of North Africa. Just a generation after that, it went as far as Constantinople, and another generation, it spread up into Europe, including Spain. And so when Islam spread into Spain, they conquered the Christians there about 600, and no, later than that, sorry. But they conquered the Christians there and they established a capital at Cordoba. So that this is the mosque from Cordoba, Spain. The 600 comes in when this was originally a Christian church that was built about 600 AD. And then several 200 years later, then it was converted to the mosque. And this is what you see, the pictures of it. And this mosque is particularly known for the lower picture that you see. For this is the prayer hall, and for these columns with the alternating colors of brick, which of course was difficult to build without any kinds of modern technology. But these horseshoe-shaped arches are supported by 514 columns. And this is the architectural feat that this mosque is particularly known for. The Taj Mahal is in India, not in Saudi Arabia or Iraq or Iran, and it is not a mosque, but it is one of the 7 wonders of the world, and it is known as the jewel of Muslim art in India. So it is related to Islamic art, particularly because of the minarets and the dome. It was built in Agra, India, on the river, and it was built to honor Emperor Shah Jahan's favorite wife, who died when she was giving birth to their 14th child. And the Emperor Shah Jahan is also buried there. So you see, it took 17 years to build, from 1633 to about 1650. And the main part of the Taj Mahal is the tomb itself of the emperor's wife. It's made of polished marble, which has a very shimmering quality, placed in a garden setting with reflecting pools, which also goes along with things that we would see with the mosque. His wife's name was Mumtaz Mahal. She was a Persian princess, and she died in that year, 1632, and right before it was started. And so he was so upset that he wanted to build this to document their love. Here is the Taj Mahal with a reflecting pool in front. You see the dome there, and all this is made of marble, as I stated. And you see these on the side, these large structures, tall, thin structures. Those are the minarets, where the muezzin would call, M-U-E-Z-Z-I-N, muezzin would call the faithful to prayer. I mentioned earlier the 2 different types of Muslims, and these 2 types developed after the death of Muhammad, when they could not decide upon a successor for Muhammad. The Sunni Muslims, which means well-trod, 85% of the world's Muslims are Sunnis. They believe that the immediate successor should have been the father of Muhammad's wife, Abu Bakr, and that the Quran endorses a selection of the best man for the job, for choosing the best caliph, which, remember, is the leader of the Muslim world, and the caliphate is the land that is under his domain. And so they believe that the Quran endorses selection of caliphs according to the consensus of the Muslim community. And then the Shia Muslims, tradition, and only 15% of the world's Muslims are Shia Muslims, believe that Muhammad, as commanded by Allah, ordained his son-in-law, Ali, to be the next caliph, and that legitimate successors must come directly from the descendants of Muhammad. So, there's a lot of fighting back and forth, and they eventually split into these 2 sections. Now, the part I'm going to talk about is Sufism, which is a branch of the Shia Muslim. And Shia Muslims are only 15%, so of course a branch of that is going to be even smaller. Sufism is the mystical dimension of Islam, and their practices led to a direct experience of God. Many of the Sufi communities are in Muslim lands, and there are several prominent Sufi writers. So of course we're getting into Islamic literature here in the next slide, but I wanted to introduce Sufism first. The Sufis had these complex movements that they believe they could, if they performed this and they concentrated, they could directly commune with Allah. And you can look this up online, and when I'm teaching this in class, then I usually pull up the YouTube video to show you the Sufist and the way they dance. Two Sufi writers are Rabia or Saint Rabia and Rumi. Saint Rabia was a woman and who lived about 800 AD, and she focused on the love of God. She believed that a highly developed love of God was the key to union with Him. She had a difficult life, but then she believed that she was one of God's chosen ones, and was to spread the love of God. She was a flute player and she wrote poetry. Rumi is probably more well known. He lived in the early 1200s and he wrote religious verse in rhyming couplets. He wrote 3,000 poems, over 70 discourses on mysticism, and he founded the Dancing Dervishes. What I mentioned in the previous slide was the Sufis who dance and have that divine connection with God. They wear large white skirts that swirl and go back and forth. It's on page 259 in your textbook. You can see a picture of the whirling dervishes, and I will also put up on your Georgia View page the link to the YouTube video to see this. But this is part of their religious devotion, and they perform this dancing to the accompaniment of musical instruments, and it is said that it may represent the souls of the just whirling towards paradise. And Rumi founded the Dancing Dervishes. So that is one thing he's remembered for. He's also remembered for all of this. He was just a prolific writer for all of this writing that he did, so much so that his writing is often called the Quran in Persian. While there are many Islamic contributions, and we're going to talk about all of those here, I would be remiss if I did not mention another Islamic writing, and one that I teach in World Lit and is worldwide known as one of the best examples of Islamic and Arabic writing, and that is the Thousand and One Nights. You have probably read it yourself. It was composed between the 9th and 14th centuries, told orally for a long time, and then written down, not a single author, but it is one of the most beloved of tales. All right, that being said, there are a lot of contributions from the Islamic world that came to us that you may not realize that they came from the Islamic world. We have paper making that made its way to us via China, but then came to the House of Wisdom at Baghdad, which we're going to talk about in just a moment. And so many of these things were put together at the House of Wisdom by Caliph al-Ma'mun. He built a library and study center there. And so much of what we have came from there because it was translated there and preserved there. And when there was a great fire in Alexandria that burned down everything that had been preserved from the Greek and Roman worlds, it was already there in Baghdad. And so we did not lose it. So much of what we have already studied came to us today by way of the House of Wisdom that was in Baghdad. Scholars came there and translated works of Aristotle. And so what we read today is a retranslation. It was translated into Arabic and then, of course, translated into whatever language of today. Also, works of Plato and Galen, their works were translated there. At the House of Wisdom, algebra was invented. It was invented by Al-Khwarizmi, and this particular scholar is important for, of course, inventing algebra and the algorithm, but also because he is the one who changed our numbering system. He changed it from Roman numerals to Arabic numbers. Arabic numbers is what we use today. I mean, y'all have seen Roman numerals. Think how awkward that would be if we still use Roman numerals instead of the Arabic numbers that we know. Also, we had swords and silk, and the first glasses were made in Baghdad at the House of Wisdom. Infectious diseases. Now think about it. If the Muslims washed themselves 5 times a day, every day before prayer, and they did not get as sick as their counterparts who were not Muslims, who were living close by, you can see the connection and how the Islamic scholars made that connection and saw that keeping oneself clean and personal hygiene led to fewer illnesses. And of course, my personal favorite that we got from the Islamic world, coffee.